We've often talked in education research about the difference between active and passive learning. And passive has been more receiving information, and active has been more manipulating that kind of information. But recently, learning scientists have started talking about splitting that idea of active into the idea of that active piece of manipulating, but then a next step, which is generating or constructing. And that idea of creating new things based on knowledge allows the student to engage in things like self-explaining and making inferences and manipulating the knowledge in new ways. So they actually start to create new knowledge beyond what they have already kind of encoded or learned from the text that they've been receiving in other ways, passively or actively. So this idea is that the generating also helps with the transfer of knowledge. So you're taking what you learned and applying it in a new context. So that can be something new or different from what you've learned, which really the research is starting to show leads to deeper understanding and a greater potential to be able to transfer that knowledge to another new situation when we're asking students to apply it. So that's a really powerful action in terms of thinking about how we're solidifying students' knowledge and allowing them to create new things. So that's one important piece of it. The second important piece is it turns out if you're going to make a game about a particular topic, you really need to know a lot about that topic. So it also just allows and requires students to go deeper into the content so that they can make a better game. So in fact, it kind of motivates that seeking out of new information. So there's a number of ways where we can think about this idea of creating and generating games is really a pretty powerful idea.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Future Tech for Education series on the Edtech Podcast supported by Pearson. This week we are looking at games-based learning, and you just heard from Dr. Kristen DiCerbo, Vice President of Education and Research at Pearson, on the learning science behind games creation. Games-based learning has been around for longer than your thumbs have been twiddling at Tetris. And proponents of GBL, as it's otherwise known, argue that using games in learning can lead to faster lesson comprehension, increased engagement, and improved test scores. Furthermore, games-based learning is often described as more accessible for learners too often on the fringes, i.e. those from a lower socio-economic background or with special educational needs. As commercial gaming companies move into the educational space, organisations like the Serious Games Institute and Games for Change are becoming increasingly necessary to navigate the edu-gaming space and to pick out the pedagogical reasons for engaging. Recent high-profile games-based learning announcements include the $1.6 million seed funding put into Finnish EdTech startup Teacher Gaming, or the £1.4 million put into Sumdog, a Scottish EdTech and gaming company who quote a progress of 1.5 years in the usual 6 months by students who use their games. But with investments in GBL up 20% year on year in 2016, what does the equivalent supporting pedagogical research look like? Whilst much of the most recent research around games-based learning appears to have been published around 2014 or 2013, more recent articles such as Substantial Integration of Typical Educational Games into Extended Curricula by Douglas Clark & Co. unsurprisingly highlight the impact of teacher experience and student engagement in the efficacy of the game condition, i.e. games don't exist and have impact on their own. Let's take this idea of coexistence one step further. What about a new approach to games-based learning, which instead of seeing games as something put in front of students, instead sees students as integral to the co-creation of games and therefore to creative learning itself? In this way, I'm thinking of the likes of BAFTA Young Games Designers or Glass Lab, where young people can tinker and break things in a gaming environment and at the same time get to know the $91 billion global video games market. Dave Chilver is a previous winner of the BAFTA Young Game Designers Mentor Award. Here's his take on how working with games design helps support both cross-curricular learning and job prospects for young people. What's the kind of pitch for the pedagogy behind games-based learning and it being a really important part of the programme as well?
I might be able to just probably repeat this word for word for a conversation I had 2 weeks ago when I pitched this very, very concept to some of my own senior leaders. And it is difficult to pitch because there is a lot of opinions and thought about the value of games. But for me personally, they are truly cross-curricular subjects. You have maths, you have science, you have computing, of course. But when you bring in a game aspect to it, there is so much more. There is art, there is design, there is potentially even things like languages where you need students to be able to create games that may be encoded into different areas of the world. And all of that aspect is a great way to get a real good cross-curricular subject. It would be fantastic to get a Key Stage 3, a Year 7 and 11-year-olds into a project where not only do they need to come up with a game with the English narrative, we'll talk about story arcs, they'll need to code that game using a bit of maths and computer science. They'll need to maybe do a little bit of subject translation with French and German and Spanish and getting all of these different skills together. And it's fun. And that's the bottom line, especially in the younger years. It needs to be something fun, something which they'll attach themselves to and say, yes, this is something that I want to do, not because teacher has told me to do it. And it's a very, very easy win.
Welcome, Dave.
Thank you very much for having me.
First up, just to get to know you a little bit, I'm going to ask you some questions here. So the first one's probably a bit of a no-brainer, but books, TV or games?
Well, I'm going to say games.
And what's your favourite all-time game and why?
I guess I'd think something like Grim Fandango. It's a game that made me think, and I actually felt an emotion. I didn't really think I'd feel that in an adventure game.
Amazing. So for people that don't know it, what's the kind of game in a nutshell?
So Grim Fandango is a point-and-click, really old-school LucasArts game where you play as Death and in the afterworld, and it's a very Mexican-themed Day of the Dead, and you have to guide a soul to heaven, which makes it sound very grim, but what it is, it's incredibly funny, it's incredibly touching about sort of life and death and those sorts of things, and it's a great game if you can get it to work on a modern PC.
So for everyone listening, can you explain a little bit about who you are and what's your kind of presence and role in gaming?
Well, my degree, way back when, is one of the first games design degrees. And after I left university, I decided to do teaching. From that, I've been trying to, throughout my career, encourage game design as a real subject. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I was given the opportunity to develop a game design curriculum at my workplace. Basically, because many of the students wanted to learn, I didn't feel the passion to go and make the games myself, but I really wanted to help people to create them. And so with the help of some of the staff at the college, I was able to develop a curriculum, create a subject, and in order to go along with that, we made a local competition for students in Suffolk to create some games and get them presented at a local gaming festival in Norwich. And that developed itself into sort of working with the BAFTA YGD competition, and that's really where it took on strength from strength. And I have moved on now, trying to recreate that in my new location, and hopefully so far it's going quite well. It's an interesting subject to talk to a class of students, because you will speak to an 11-year-old who will want to be able to make Call of Duty, which obviously is an 18 certificate game and has all sorts of implications, but it's not just that, the level of understanding of how that game comes across. You know, that sort of game will take years to make, millions of dollars, hundreds of people with various different talents, and a student in year 7 would want to try and approach that. And so it's about actually taking it back. And one of the first things that I often do with my classes is actually wind the clock back to the 70s and 80s and show them the sorts of games that people created on their own, so people can understand, well, what is possible for you to create in 6 months on your own. And we look at some of the classic arcade games and some of the very early home console games to say, well, I can't make Call of Duty with you in this year, but I can make this with you in 2 months. And that's where we start. And from that, it gives them the confidence to actually go, okay, I understand what I need to do. Things like Pong, things like Pac-Man, things like missile defense games, these sorts of ones, which are relatively simple, but they're actually really effective. And actually, those sorts of games are fantastic to get people learning about sort of game processes, the thinking side of it, the artwork. When students come in and they want to recreate Grand Theft Auto, they'll get very caught up on things like the narrative and story, which, although are important, are ultimately nothing to do with the science of learning games. And it's about getting back to those core concepts, and that's where you get your coding, that's where you get your very simple graphics, and from that we can then build it.
And what are the games that you've been most sort of wowed by students that have come up with a concept and tried to build those out as well?
We often do sort of mini game design sessions where they have an hour to design a game, which sounds particularly harsh. And we give them a dice, and they have to roll the dice, and depending on the number, I'll have 6 settings, like a snowy place, a hot place, a dry place, a wet place, and they roll the dice, and if it comes up with number 4, you've got a snowy place, and they roll another dice, and they'll get a different theme, and they get these 6 themes together, and they'll need to create a game. And the most amazing one that I had was last year. Someone got a snowy theme, sense of loneliness, the smell of fish, and what was the other one? The other one was something like the sense of foreboding, or something like that. And they created on paper, so it wasn't coded, but they came up with a story of a game of this old man in a village in Iceland, and he was the only one left in his village. Everyone else had left, and he had to go out each day to collect wood in the tundra, and there was a snowstorm, and had to bring it back, and he had to light a fire to cook his fish. And that was the only part of the game, and the idea was that there was no way to win the game. You would just do it for as long as you could until eventually you died of loneliness. And it was about how old people are looked after in modern world. I looked at that and I thought that was fantastic. Another one, which was actually one of the ones that I thought was one of my best ones from last year, was a young girl who designed a game based, and as sad as it might be, in the Bosnian Civil War. I don't know how she knew much about this, but she based a game in Sarajevo, in the Bosnian Civil War, and you played as a fox. And the two sides are always shooting at each other, of course, but you never saw any of that. But whatever happened, everyone hated the fox. And the fox would have to go around, it would take food and all of this sort of stuff, and people would chase it. But the fox had a choice. And every time it found food, there was always a hungry civilian, a young kid or a family. And the fox had a choice to eat the food or give the food away to the young family. And it was the idea that in war, no one wins. Everyone is sad. And that was one of those ones where they had to roll the dice. And I thought, if I'd have sat down a 10-year-old student and said, could you design a game? That would have been the last thing that came to their mind. But it was just that spark of creativity, and I thought that was fantastic.
How about sort of measuring impact? How about within the school setting? How do you go about measuring that as well?
One of the definite big impacts has been the strong take-up in computer science that I've had from female students, which was almost unheard of. I started at my jobs 4 or 5 years ago, and I had no female students in computer science at all. And with this competition, when I'd gone into high schools, we'd done the projects, we'd worked in groups, sort of encouraging students to come into that, and within 4 years, I'd had all of a sudden 50% of my applicants to the competition were girls, and my students that had come onto my A-level course, I now had around about 10-15% were female from zero. And obviously that's not 50-50 by any means, but that was a significant increase in 4 years. And every single one of the students that was on that course was a student that I had seen at high school with these projects. And it was from that I felt that seemed to give them confidence. So that's been a huge impact. But it was also just impact that I saw in students wanting to work extracurricularly outside in clubs. I'd leave students and they would come back a week later. I've watched a tutorial on Unity on YouTube, and they've done something else. Or I created a something in Scratch, and it was really good to see that sort of impact. And from that, you have more interested students, and they became more aware of their choices and what they wanted to do. My students who were in the competition, more often than not, had a target in life. It was to get to university, or it was to get to work experience, and they knew the grades, and that was very much a motivator. It wasn't they were doing the work because mum and dad had told them to, or because I would give them attention. It was because I want to go work for Blizzard. I want to go work for Rockstar. I want to be an independent game designer. I want to create iOS apps. And that was something that pushed them in maths, in English, across the board.
And what do you build your games in? What do you use? What tools?
Well, I've used pretty much anything that the students are happy with. We have Unity, which is free to use, and it's fantastic, although it is quite complex, and it does have a steep learning curve, but it is very useful. But outside of that, something like Scratch, of course, is a great entry one, especially for year 7s and 8s. Game Maker is a fantastic piece of programming software. Kodu I've used occasionally, but had mixed results on that one. It's a little bit too simplistic, but those sorts of ones are really fantastic for anyone who wants to get into it and start learning the coding side at least.
In terms of timetabling as well, just to get into the detail of it, is this all within the school day, or do you also do stuff outside of the school day? How do you kind of recommend to sort of other teachers listening in that they do that based on your experience?
Yes, it is a very difficult one, and it's a fight that I've had throughout my entire career in the 4 different education places I've worked at. Every single time, the initial boundary is, why should we do games? And the second boundary is, we don't have any training in this. And it's difficult. It is difficult. So initially, it was after school clubs. That's all I was allowed to do. And it was done in my own time. It was something I was passionate about, and I was happy to do an hour a week of just starting off initially with a sort of game theory. So it was a lot of design work. And in the BAFTA competition, it would be something like the Game Concept Award. No programming needed, no technical skills, but it was just a little bit of game theory. And that was a great way to just get the students interested. And then afterwards, when the network managers allowed me, I'd install various things, software like Scratch, etc. That Scratch is fairly common these days, so that should be okay. And I now have pretty much free reign in the Key Stage 3, year 7, 8 and 9 students. I have a dedicated project which I'm allowed to do for games, which is fantastic. So each year I'll have a 6-week project which is games-based, where we'll either do a little programming in Scratch or playing around with a little bit of Unity or doing a bit of game design work. In Key Stage 4, the GCSE, unfortunately, there's not a huge amount of games-based options for people wanting to do that, but it does get a little bit better for the A-levels. Post-16, the BTEC Creative Media courses are fantastic for anyone who's wanting a little bit more focus on that. But training-wise, there's a lot of stuff that's free, and that's the best thing about it. YouTube is your friend. There's fantastic forums and all that sort of stuff. Of course, that doesn't help the teacher who doesn't have the time, but one of the things that I hope to do that's helped me significantly is local networking, finding teachers around that are willing to try and pull some of their resources and complete all of this together. Because if we can sort of work together on these sorts of things, actually it becomes significantly easier to really produce that work.
Unity is a game development platform that last year was valued at $2.6 billion. It's the engine behind 50% of mobile games and about half of all PC games. It's also set to change how we experience everything from online shopping to healthcare. But what is Unity's position on the value of games in education?
So, the real vision is, how do we enable everyone to create their dreams? Truly, any community you're born into, any school you go to, we want to give you the tools that you can learn how to use Unity and how to create what you want to create.
That's Jessica Lindell, Global Head of Education at Unity, who I spoke to recently in London. I'm very excited for you to be here. So just some rapid fire questions so that all of our listeners can get to know you before we delve into the games-based learning stuff. Can you change a car tyre?
I can.
You can? I don't think I can. How often do you sing?
Daily, to the chagrin of my family.
How do you feel when you hear your national anthem?
Very depressed right now. That will hopefully change in the next election.
And last one, what games are you playing these days?
Oh, really bad chess is my favorite.
Okay. Excellent. Well, now we've got all the serious stuff out of the way. Can you tell us a little bit about your role at Unity and also how you got into that role as well?
Sure, absolutely. So in Global Head of Education at Unity, my focus is on democratizing creativity, so enabling everyone globally to become a creator. I'm a longtime EdTech worker bee trying to make a change in the education industry, and I discovered along the way that enabling a learner to create is the most powerful skill set we can give them, not just STEM skills, but STEAM skills to really drive that creativity. I came into this role because I was running a game company that was creating educational games. And I learned through that experience that consuming games was not enough for our learners, that they actually wanted to mod and recreate the games themselves. And that enabled me to move into this opportunity and create change on a global level.
And so the previous place, what was that called again?
It's called Glass Lab.
Glass Lab. And that's still going and people can go and find out about that?
They can, yep. Just Google Glass Lab and you can download SimCity, Words with Friends, a bunch of other titles we recreated into middle school assessments.
Now you're at Unity. So can you tell us a little bit about how that all came about? And
Sure. Yep, absolutely. I came across Unity about 6 years ago when I started Glass Lab because I needed a development tool that could allow me to mod such huge games like SimCity, and Unity was frankly the only answer out there. It's an enormously sophisticated and powerful tool that at the same time is easy to learn and use. So that's what we started our company on, and Unity was an incredible partner in that journey, which is how I got to know the company. And the CEO of Unity today, John Riccatello, is really, I think, one of the greatest leaders out there right now who's both focused on democratizing creativity, but also focused on education. And so when he reached out for this role, I couldn't say no because I know how passionate he is and the company is.
And that's the thing. So I was reading about John and in his sort of vision in terms of Unity and retail and some of the other areas. So what's the kind of big vision around education?
Any school you go to, we want to give you the tools that you can learn how to use Unity and how to create what you want to create. That also makes great business sense too, because the more creators we have, the more the business grows, and we are a for-profit company.
I guess those students, they may become, the games developers of the future.
Exactly. As well as you heard from John, developers of interactive experiences, retail, being able to, try on clothes virtually, try on shoes virtually, a much more expansive opportunity than just games. I think the learning process of learning how to create is really represented in BAFTA. They've got an incredible community, which if you look at the pedagogy that we approach and how we create, learning how to create Unity, it's got a couple of key components. One is that it's very project-based and evidence-based, which I think BAFTA does a great job of. And then secondly, you've got a strong community of mentors, peers who are supporting you and giving you feedback in the process. We host a few student game competitions in other countries. We are considering doing a global one, but ideally it would be in partnership with a strong program like BAFTA.
And how about in the US? Is there like a main competition like that? I mean, it's
Games for Change is probably the most analogous.
What about some of your projects on co-creation? So are there any particular projects that you have where you've combined sort of the developers within Unity with teachers, or where teachers have used the Unity platform to really create something amazing with their students?
We do. Yeah, we've got some incredible examples of what students have been able to create with Unity that we've given advice on. I think another good example is we have a platform called Connect, which is where any learner can go on, put their portfolio on there, get feedback from the community, from Unity developers to improve it and actually find jobs and connect to jobs. And so from that platform and other research, we've been able to discover that Unity developers actually make $20,000 more than their peers who don't have Unity skills. Also able to see that it's the highest demand skill in the market right now from an IT perspective.
Okay, so that's for all the careers advisors listening in.
Exactly.
Like you said, Unity is an external and for-profit company, as are, we're at the BET show here. So how do you kind of go about the responsibility for working with educators, working with students, and what's the kind of pedagogy behind it? How do you sort of bring that dynamic of also a consumer-facing organisation to what's happening in education, I suppose?
So we have many different types of learners at Unity: professionals, adult hobbyists, and obviously students and educators. Our philosophy is to enable all students and educators to learn Unity for free. So we give the Unity license and platform to educators for free as a grant to the educators. We also provide tools to them for free that follow our recommended pedagogical approach, which again is very project-based, evidence-based learning and peer-reviewed and community-supported learning experience. We don't dictate they use it that way. Given that we're providing it for free, it's up to them on how they want to implement it and align it to their local standards or the demands that they're facing.
So it's sort of curriculum neutral in that way.
Exactly, yeah.
And if people are listening in and they want to find out more, what's the best way for them to go about that as well?
Just go to unity3d.com/learn and you'll have access to all of our resources, materials, and how to apply for the grant program.
Thanks, Jessica. The concept of the 3 C's and the importance of critical thinking is well drilled among educational thinking outside of GBL alone, and something we have spoken about on the Edtech Podcast in episodes 77 and 96, to name but a few. But how do you pitch the idea of gaming as educational to a busy and risk-averse school leader with little time on their hands? Here's Steve Isaacs, an ISTE outstanding teacher, blogger and lead digital innovator, to tell us more.
Thanks for having me.
So I just wanted to start with whether you could tell us a little bit about your school, about your particular background, and also how you came to be blogging at Games and Learning and getting into this space as well.
Yeah, well, so it's real interesting. I teach at William Annan Middle School in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. It's a great school district, high performing school district. It's in an affluent area, fairly traditional in a lot of ways. But on the flip side of that, I am extremely pleased that I've had a lot of autonomy to be able to create my curriculum and my courses over the time here. So that's really amazing, because I did ask a number of years ago to create a game development program, which seemed very far-fetched, and received tremendous support from my supervisor and my principal, which has allowed this to happen. So, which has really transformed my excitement about what's possible in learning. I actually started in special education. I taught for 6 years in a self-contained class for students with developmental disabilities, which kind of stemmed from some work I did in college at group homes with adults with disabilities, and then had no real idea that I could get into, following something I'm really passionate about to make my career go in that direction. While I was at that school, I ended up with my wife and another couple. We opened a computer training and gaming center, which gave us wonderful opportunities to offer computer camps and after school classes. And because we were offering them to the public, we had a lot of freedom in terms of bringing programs that people wanted, which is where a lot of this game-based learning kind of stuff started for me before I think we really had a term for game-based learning, because this goes back 20 years. And we also then on weekends opened as a multiplayer gaming center. So I started to really see how we could, use games as a vehicle for learning as well as building community. And it's been a joyride ever since.
If you pretend you meet me at an event and I've got lost and I should be going to the Rejuvenating Traditional Education Conference, but I've got lost and I've ended up at an EduGaming Summit, how would you pitch the potential of co-creating games to me in an educational context?
Right. That's a wonderful question. First of all, I'm glad you got lost. So I have been fortunate enough to be able to teach this game design and development course. What I've noticed, and I share with you as this lost soul, is that for learning, as an introduction to computer science, let's just say, in a very meaningful and relevant way, engages kids in their world. Kids are interested in games. There's no doubt about that. Why not bring in what they're passionate about and use that as a context for learning? So giving kids these opportunities is tremendous. And what I've also noticed is that it goes far beyond coding, in that there are so many, the game design industry right now is a tremendous industry. It rivals the movie industry. So the reality of so many opportunities in that field for kids is great. So why not give them opportunities to find their niche within that? So game creation is so co-curricular. I mean, you have the narrative piece. So we have kids writing storyline for games and doing more writing than they might do in their English course. We have, graphic design and animation. We're moving into a space of virtual reality. So we have kids having opportunities to create for that space and also be on the cutting edge of that, and then there's also audio engineering. I mean, so many facets to this industry that it gives kids an opportunity to see just what's possible. And whether it be that they go into that area or not, it certainly immerses them in the iterative design process, which they would take with them into any role. I mean, you're never in a project situation where you're not, designing, iterating, improving, testing, all of that. So the skills are actually generalized quite well. So I think it opens up a whole world of possibilities.
I just wondered what some of the most memorable projects that you've worked on with your students have been.
So a lot of it is the whole idea of supporting them in learning what they're working with and then seeing their strengths come out. I mean, I have a lot of kids creating text-based adventures currently, which is like amazing to me because I thought the last thing they would want to do would be the part that focuses on the writing, and then to go into probably my most exciting project that came about, I mean, I guess in a sense by accident. I had a student who got very into the coding aspect of one of the tools we were using called Game Maker Studio. And for his 20% time or Genius Hour project, he was learning to create his game fully in code and learn that language inside and out. I was approached by a publisher to write a book on coding in Game Maker language. And I was about to decline because I really was not equipped to write this. I don't have those skills. It's not what I teach the kids. In this case, this kid, really embraced it and learned the majority on his own. So I did go back to the publisher and I said, listen, I'd be happy to co-author the book, but let it be very well known that it's an 8th grader that's going to be doing the majority of the writing, and I'll support him in the process, but he's the expert here. And we did, and we had the book published, and it was just, the reason it was so exciting, I think, is it really, cemented all of the things that are so important to me, which is like giving students a voice, giving student choice in the learning process, and really leveraging student expertise. So in this case, that's about as authentic of a project as you could ever produce. So that was really exciting.
That's very cool. And is that book still available?
It is. It's called Game Maker Programming by Example, and it is put out by PACT, P-A-C-K-T Publishing, and it is available.
So you mentioned your school is, in an affluent area, and you're lucky enough to have, a really well-resourced studio. Do you know the effectiveness of games-based learning in different contexts?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the interesting things is when I was working with kids with special needs, at that point, I happened to be in a science and technology magnet school. Now, my students were not there because it was a science and technology magnet school. They were there because that was the one school that had room for my class. But our good fortune was that we had a lot of resources. So I did leverage, the use of technology with my students, and I did find great success in a lot of ways in individualizing and, personalizing learning. My students were all on different levels. So in that context, it's great to be able to have everybody engaged in the learning that's happening through the game, but also not feeling like I have to keep everybody at the same pace. So games do that very well, right? Like if I'm playing a game and I'm, struggling, which is part of the way games are designed, as I succeed, I'm not holding other people back. I'm not, that kind of thing. So there's that. You definitely need to also add in your show notes some of the work by Matthew Farber recently. He has 2 great books out that really speak to game-based learning. I believe the one is Gamify Your Class, and it's really about game-based learning in the classroom. And the other is GBL in Action, and it talks about, practitioners and how they're using game-based learning in the classroom. But he's, done tremendous research in terms of interviewing anybody and everybody in the game-based learning sector. So you'll draw a lot from those examples. But, I find that games engage and immerse kids in the learning. I sometimes try to get cautious about the term engagement is very popular. Engagement is a tough term because kids could definitely be engaged, and that doesn't necessarily mean the learning is taking place. But when the gameplay matches the learning objectives, and then kids are engaged and immersed in the environment, the learning kind of happens experientially, which I think is of tremendous value. And, I'm not a researcher myself, but there are some great researchers out there that are looking at the true learning outcomes and benefits that are coming out of games. But I'm a huge proponent just from my own experiences of seeing, the learning that happens, through games. And like you had mentioned, game creation in my case is great because the kids are creating and problem solving, and it's on a very high level.
How does your work sort of sit next to the rest of the curriculum, and how long do the students work with you on their projects, and, what's the kind of scheme of work there as well?
So, in a middle school, we teach 5 periods a day. When I started, it was a variety of courses. And then when I had asked about teaching the game design and development course, that course immediately became very popular. So in 8th grade, I can teach 3 periods a day or 3 sections, and that's an elective, so it's for half a year. So my students I have for, I guess it comes down to 20 weeks in the school year, 40 minutes a day every day. That's my 8th graders. What was happening, which was interesting, is that it was mostly boys signing up for the class, and that had me a little concerned because all the research says that this is such a crucial age for kids in terms of determining what they think they like and what they feel they're good at. So I went back to my administration and asked if we could change our 7th grade curriculum in computers, which is a 6-week cycle course, and we changed that to a course in game design and digital storytelling. So now every 7th grader in our school takes this 6-week experience in game design and digital storytelling, which gives everybody that experience. It's a more interesting computer course than when we were doing more traditional, applications and Microsoft Word and such. So everybody enjoys it. And it also helps people kind of get a sense for whether they're interested in pursuing it further. So, that's my course structure because of the elective and the cycle structure. It is isolated in a sense because it is an elective. So it's not so much that we're using the context of this course within other courses, which I think would be a great next step. And that's where your original question too about co-creation, where you have other teachers coming about saying, hey, I'd like to do something with a set of students. And that would be a wonderful idea for, let's say a social studies teacher to say, hey, I want to create something and have several of their own students have this as a special project and work together. That would be, a huge win if we got to that point.
Have any of your students gone on to pursue either a design or affiliated work after their experience?
Yeah, I have a number of students that have, ended up working at game studios. I have one who worked for a while at Microsoft on the Xbox team, one that's at Blizzard Entertainment, and I'm sure others. And I've heard of a lot from their experience here where they would, whether or not they went directly into games, many did go into something like computer science or graphic arts. But and then some are, still dabbling in independent game development. One guy I just came across recently on LinkedIn that is developing an independent game, on his own now, as his full-time vocation. So that was really neat to see.
That's awesome. And just finally, as we're running out of time, we have a kind of book club as part of the podcast where our guests recommend excellent reads in the space. So you mentioned a couple before, but are there any other books or people online or other places that you would like to point people towards in this area?
Yeah, so many. So I have to point to the work of Chris Haskell and Lisa Dawley when I think of my career path, mainly because choice-based learning has become so important to me and creating learning, giving kids choice in their learning pathways. And that came from my following their work a number of years ago with 3D Game Lab. And they had some teacher professional development that was very, gamified in this quest-based manner. And it was a great way to learn and sort of enter that space. So, I always think of them. And then on a final note, not that you would find much to read by him, but Jack Beeson was my high school computer and calculus teacher. And it wasn't until a few years ago that I even remembered that in his class, while learning basic programming, I was allowed to create my own game. And it was without question the most exciting project I've embarked upon in school. And I remember that whole idea that I see with my students where I, worked outside of class hours, not because we had homework, but because I was interested. And, that was just that was a game changer for me. I'm very active on Twitter. It's probably the easiest place to find and interact with me. On Twitter, I'm at Mr. like MR _ Isaacs, ISAACS. And I love to interact with people in that space and to support people and learn with and from people. And yeah, definitely find me and let's connect.
Thanks, Steve. That's the end of this week's episode. Thank you to all the guests who joined, and happy gaming. If you're interested in learning through gaming, go and check out the BAFTA Young Games Designer Awards and think about entering. Want to leave feedback? Tweet us at Podcast Edtech and at Kristen DiCerbo, or check out the Pearson Podcast page at tinyurl.com/Pearson Future Tech. I'll drop that link, show notes and more at the edtechpodcast.com.
Throughout human history, one of our big successes has been the development of more and more technology.
How do we move the student forward? How does the student move themselves forward?
And that what is an application of skills and knowledge at a moment in time.
What should the humans do versus what should you let technology do?
I think it opens up a whole world of possibilities.
We are seeing improvements of learning as a function of playing different games.
So as educators, we have to stop and say, how do we approach this?
It's so cool that we can get students to engage with computations and so on.
Everybody's got to be in the learning business.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more on AI, languages, gaming, assessment without tests and personalised learning, make sure you subscribe to the EdTech Podcast on iTunes, where you can also leave a review. Thanks for listening in, and we look forward to hearing your own Future Tech for Education related stories. Have a great week!